The crystal vase shattered across the marble floor. The sound echoed through the silent mansion like a gunshot. Every servant froze. Standing at the center of the grand living room was Adrian Blackwood, one of the youngest billionaire CEOs in the country. His jaw tightened as he stared at the broken antique, an heirloom worth millions, imported from Europe nearly a century ago. In front of him stood Martha, the mansion's elderly maid. Her trembling hands still reached toward the shattered pieces, as if she could somehow undo what had just happened. I'm so sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It slipped." Adrian's face hardened. 30 years in this house, and this is how you repay my trust," he said coldly. "You're fired." The room fell silent. Martha slowly removed her faded apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the nearby table. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. Instead, she looked into Adrian's eyes with a sadness that seemed far older than the wrinkles on her face. As she turned to leave, she stopped at the doorway. Without looking back, she spoke in a quiet voice. "I once held you before anyone else ever did." Adrian's heartbeat stopped. Before he could ask what she meant, the old woman walked out of the mansion, leaving behind nothing but silence, and a mystery that would change everything he believed about his family. Adrian Blackwood wasn't just wealthy. He was the face of modern success. At only 35 years old, he had transformed his late father's company into a global business empire worth billions. Business magazines called him a visionary. Investors admired his fearless decisions. Employees respected him, but few truly knew him. Behind the expensive suits and confident speeches was a man who kept everyone at arm's length. To Adrian, emotions were distractions, mistakes were unacceptable, and trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Every minute of his life was scheduled. Every decision was calculated. His world ran on discipline, perfection, and control. The Blackwood mansion reflected its owner perfectly. Its polished marble floors gleamed under towering chandeliers. Priceless paintings lined the walls. Every piece of furniture had its place, and every servant knew the rules. Nothing was allowed to be out of order. Yet despite all its beauty, the mansion never felt like a home. The halls were filled with silence instead of laughter. Among the staff, one person had been there longer than anyone else. Her name was Martha. For more than 30 years, she quietly cared for the mansion without asking for recognition. She woke before sunrise, prepared meals, polished every room, and made sure everything ran smoothly. Most people barely noticed her, but those who worked beside her often wondered why she looked at Adrian with such quiet affection. Whenever he skipped breakfast, Martha would leave a warm meal outside his office without saying a word. Whenever he returned home exhausted after midnight, a cup of his favorite tea somehow appeared on his desk before he even asked. She remembered every birthday, every achievement, every difficult day. It was as if she had been watching over him his entire life. Adrian never questioned it. To him, Martha was simply the loyal maid who had served his family for decades. His parents, Richard and Eleanor Blackwood, were among the city's most influential figures. They had built a reputation of elegance, power, and prestige. Publicly, they appeared to be the perfect family. But behind the mansion's grand doors, warmth was rare. Richard spent most of his time expanding the family business, while Eleanor devoted herself to charity galas, social events, and maintaining the family's flawless image. Neither of them showed much affection toward their only son. As a child, Adrian grew up surrounded by luxury, but starved of love. The only constant presence during those lonely years had been someone he had never truly noticed. An elderly maid who always seemed to know exactly what he needed before he did. And now, after firing her over a broken vase, Adrian couldn't stop hearing the words she had whispered before walking away. "I once held you before anyone else ever did." What had sounded like the final words of a dismissed servant were about to unravel a family secret that had remained buried for more than 3 decades. The mansion returned to its usual silence. The shattered vase had been cleaned away. A new centerpiece stood in its place. The servants carried on with their duties as if nothing had happened. But for Adrian, nothing felt normal anymore. No matter how hard he tried to focus on work, Martha's final words echoed in his mind. I once held you before anyone else ever did." The sentence made no sense. His mother had often spoken proudly about the day he was born. Family photographs showed Eleanor cradling him as a newborn. Newspaper clippings celebrated the arrival of the Blackwood heir. So, why did Martha sound so certain? The next morning, Adrian arrived at the headquarters of Blackwood Industries for an important board meeting. Executives discussed billion-dollar investments, market expansion, and a major international merger. Normally, Adrian dominated every discussion. Today, he barely heard a word. His thoughts kept drifting back to the old woman who had quietly left the mansion with nothing more than a small suitcase. After the meeting, his assistant, Daniel, entered the office. "Sir," he said cautiously, "I've processed Martha's final paycheck, just as you requested." Adrian looked up. "Did she say anything before she left?" Daniel shook his head. "No, sir. She simply thanked the staff, packed a few belongings, and walked away." He hesitated before adding, "She refused the company car. She said she'd rather take the bus." For reasons he couldn't explain, that answer unsettled Adrian. 30 years of loyal service, and she had left with only a worn suitcase and a bus ticket. That evening, Adrian returned to the mansion. For the first time in years, he noticed the little things Martha used to do. His favorite tea wasn't waiting in his study. The fresh flowers in the hallway hadn't been replaced. The grandfather clock, always wound perfectly every Sunday, had stopped ticking. The house looked the same, but it felt strangely empty. As he walked past the servants' quarters, he found Martha's room unlocked. Inside, the tiny room was almost bare. A neatly made bed, a small wooden wardrobe, a worn Bible resting on a bedside table. It was hard to believe someone had lived here for 3 decades. Then something caught his eye. Tucked inside the drawer was an old photograph. Its edges were faded with age. It showed a much younger Martha sitting in a hospital chair, smiling gently as she held a newborn baby wrapped in a white blanket. The baby's face was partially hidden, but hanging from the tiny wrist was a silver bracelet engraved with a single name, Adrian. His breath caught. His hands began to tremble. How could she have this? For the first time in his life, Adrian realized that the woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a maid might have been hiding a truth that no one had ever dared to tell him, and he was determined to uncover it. That night, Adrian couldn't sleep. The faded photograph lay on his desk beneath the glow of a single lamp. He had examined it dozens of times, hoping to find an explanation that made sense. But every time his eyes landed on the tiny silver bracelet engraved with his name, the same question echoed through his mind. Why was Martha holding me as a newborn? At sunrise, Adrian made a decision. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing a business deal. He was chasing the truth. He ordered his assistant, Daniel, to cancel every meeting for the day. "Sir, you have investors flying in from Singapore," Daniel reminded him. "They can wait," Adrian replied. "I need access to every family record we have." Daniel looked surprised. Adrian had never postponed an important meeting before. Within an hour, dusty boxes from the mansion's private archive were stacked across the library floor. Family albums, medical files, old newspapers, birth certificates, letters. For hours, Adrian searched through decades of documents. Everything appeared normal. His birth certificate listed Richard and Eleanor Blackwood as his parents. The hospital records matched the date of his birth. Family photographs showed Eleanor proudly posing with her newborn son. It all seemed perfect, too perfect. As he continued searching, Adrian noticed something strange. Several pages from the hospital file had been carefully removed. Not torn by accident, removed deliberately. Only neat gaps remained where important documents should have been. His heartbeat quickened. Someone had wanted those records to disappear. He immediately drove to St. Anne's Hospital, the place where he had been born more than 3 decades earlier. The building had been renovated, but some of the older employees still remembered the Blackwood family. An elderly receptionist frowned as she searched the hospital archives. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "Many records from that period were transferred to storage years ago." Just as Adrian was about to leave, a frail voice called from the end of the hallway. "You're Richard Blackwood's son, aren't you?" He turned to see an elderly woman in a wheelchair, wearing a retired nurse's badge. "My name is Evelyn," she said softly. "I worked in the maternity ward the night you were born." Adrian's pulse raced. "I need you to tell me about that night." The old nurse studied his face for several long seconds before speaking. "I've carried that memory for 35 years. She sighed. "Your mother wasn't the one who stayed beside your crib." Adrian frowned. "What do you mean?" "Eleanor visited only when photographers arrived," Evelyn replied quietly. "She left most of the childcare to someone else." "Who?" The old nurse's eyes filled with sadness. "Martha." The name hit Adrian like a thunderbolt. "Nights, mornings, whenever you cried," Evelyn continued. "It was Martha who held you. Martha who fed you. Martha who sang to you until you fell asleep." Adrian stood speechless. "Why?" he finally whispered. The nurse slowly shook her head. "I promised someone I would never reveal everything." She reached into her handbag and removed a worn envelope, yellowed with age. "I've kept this for decades, hoping the truth would someday find its rightful owner." She handed it to Adrian. Written across the front in faded handwriting were 5 words that sent a chill through his entire body. "For Adrian, when he's ready." Adrian stared at the envelope, his hands trembling. Who had written it, and why had it been hidden from him for 35 years? Without opening it, he already knew one thing. The life he believed was his was built on secrets. Adrian sat alone in his office long after sunset. The unopened envelope rested on his desk. For several minutes, he simply stared at it. Every instinct told him that once he opened it, there would be no turning back. Finally, he slid a letter opener beneath the brittle seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter and a small brass key. The handwriting was elegant but slightly faded with age. The first line made his heart skip. "If you are reading this, then the time has finally come for you to know the truth." The letter wasn't signed. Instead, it instructed him to visit an old address on the outskirts of the city, a modest house that had once belonged to Martha before she moved into the Blackwood mansion decades ago. The brass key, it explained, unlocked a wooden chest hidden beneath the floorboards of the bedroom. Without wasting another moment, Adrian drove through the pouring rain. The neighborhood couldn't have been more different from the luxurious world he had always known. Small homes lined the narrow streets. Children played outside despite the drizzle. Neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles. It was the kind of place Adrian had never imagined Martha came from. The old house had been empty for years, but the lock still accepted the brass key. The door creaked open. Dust covered every piece of furniture. Family photographs had faded on the walls. Everything inside felt frozen in time. Following the letter's instructions, Adrian entered the small bedroom. He knelt beside the worn wooden bed and carefully lifted a loose floorboard. Just as the letter promised, a small wooden chest rested beneath it. His hands trembled as he opened the lid. Inside were carefully preserved memories. A tiny knitted baby blanket, a newborn hospital bracelet, several birthday cards written in Martha's handwriting, but never delivered, a pair of baby shoes, and beneath them all, a worn leather diary. Adrian slowly opened the first page. "This diary is for the child I promised to protect." His breathing grew heavier. Each page revealed pieces of a life he had never known. Martha wrote about sleepless nights spent rocking a crying baby. She described his first smile, his first fever, his first steps across the nursery floor. Every milestone was recorded with the love and pride of a devoted mother. Yet one sentence appeared over and over again. He must never know, not until the time is right. Near the final pages, Adrian found a photograph he had never seen before. It showed Martha standing beside a young woman in a hospital room. The woman looked exhausted but radiant as she cradled a newborn baby. On the back of the photograph were 6 handwritten words. "The day we made our promise." Adrian's eyes filled with confusion. Who was the young woman? What promise had they made? As he turned the next page, a folded piece of paper slipped from the diary. It was a death certificate. The name printed across the top was not Eleanor Blackwood. It belonged to a woman Adrian had never heard of. His entire body went numb. If this woman had died on the very day he was born, then who exactly had she been? And why had Martha spent 35 years protecting a secret that everyone else had buried? For the first time, Adrian realized that the truth wasn't simply hidden. It had been carefully guarded by the one person he had never thought to question. Adrian couldn't wait another second. The next morning, he took the death certificate and the diary to Daniel. "I want to know everything about this woman," he said. "No matter how deeply someone buried the truth. Dig it up." Daniel had worked for Adrian for over 10 years. He had never seen his employer so shaken. Within hours, investigators began tracing old hospital records, newspaper archives, and government documents that had long been forgotten. By evening, Daniel returned carrying a thin, weathered file. There wasn't much left, he admitted. Someone made sure of that. Adrian opened the folder. The first page contained the name from the death certificate. Grace Miller. Age: 24. Occupation: temporary housekeeper. Place of employment: Blackwood Mansion. Adrian's hands tightened around the file. Martha wasn't just a maid, Daniel continued quietly. She and Grace grew up in the same village. According to the records, they were like sisters. Adrian felt his pulse quicken. He turned the page. There was a faded photograph of two young women laughing together beneath a large oak tree. One was Martha. The other had the same gentle eyes, the same warm smile. Grace. Another document revealed that Grace had arrived at the Blackwood Mansion only months before Adrian was born. Then, without explanation, her employment ended. Officially, she had left due to personal reasons, but there were no resignation papers, no forwarding address, nothing, just silence. Daniel placed another document on the desk. I also found something the investigators almost missed. It was an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Young woman dies during childbirth at St. Anne's Hospital." The article mentioned that Grace had no known family to claim her belongings. Only one person remained by her bedside until her final breath. Martha. Adrian's chest grew heavy. The pieces were beginning to fit together. But the biggest question still remained. Who was his father? That answer came from an unexpected source. Late that evening, Adrian received a phone call from the retired nurse, Evelyn. Her voice trembled. "I've carried this burden long enough." An hour later, Adrian met her at her small apartment. She slowly opened an old wooden box and removed a sealed envelope. "I was told never to give this to anyone," she whispered. "But the people who made that promise are gone now." Inside was a handwritten statement signed by Grace only hours before she died. Tears blurred Adrian's vision as he read. "If anything happens to me, please let Martha protect my son. I don't want him growing up knowing the shame that powerful people will place upon his birth. Promise me he'll have a better life, even if he never knows I'm his mother." Adrian lowered the letter, unable to breathe. Evelyn gently placed a trembling hand over his. "Grace gave birth to you." The room fell silent. "But she wasn't alone," Evelyn continued. "Martha never left her side. She held you the moment you entered this world. She cleaned you, wrapped you in that little blanket, and placed you in Grace's arms." A tear rolled down Adrian's cheek. "So, Martha's words," Evelyn nodded. "They were true. I once held you before anyone else ever did." She paused before revealing the final piece. After Grace died, Richard Blackwood arrived at the hospital. Adrian looked up. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the next words. "He admitted that you were his son." The world seemed to stop. Evelyn continued softly. "To protect the family's reputation, Richard and his wife, Eleanor, decided to raise you as their own. The adoption papers were arranged in secret. The hospital records were altered. Everyone involved was paid to remain silent." "And Martha?" Adrian whispered. "She refused to leave you." Evelyn smiled sadly. "She made one request. Let me stay close enough to watch him grow." Richard agreed. Not as family, not as a guardian, but as the maid. For 35 years, Martha buried her own love, hid her own grief, and watched the little boy she had promised to protect grow into a man who never knew the sacrifice she had made. Adrian closed his eyes. Every warm meal, every comforting smile, every birthday remembered, every silent act of kindness. None of it had been duty. It had been a promise, and with crushing regret, Adrian realized the last thing he had ever said to the woman who had loved him like a mother was, "You're fired." The reunion with Martha changed Adrian Blackwood forever. The man who had once measured success by profits and power now began measuring it by something far more valuable: the lives he could touch. The following week, the headlines weren't about a billion-dollar merger or a record-breaking stock price. Instead, every major news outlet carried the same unexpected announcement. Blackwood Foundation launches National Support Program for Domestic Workers and Single Mothers. The foundation offered free health care for retired household staff, scholarships for children of domestic workers, emergency financial assistance for struggling single mothers, and safe housing for elderly caregivers who had nowhere else to go. When reporters asked Adrian what inspired such a life-changing decision, he smiled, but gave only a simple answer: "I finally learned the true meaning of family." No further explanation was needed. Back at the mansion, Adrian made another decision that surprised everyone. Martha would never again live in a servant's room. The small room she had occupied for 35 years was carefully emptied. Not erased, but preserved exactly as it had been. Her diary, the faded photographs, the knitted baby blanket, and the tiny hospital bracelet were placed in a glass display case inside the family library. Not as secrets, but as treasured memories. Meanwhile, the grand guest suite overlooking the gardens was renovated for Martha. When she hesitated, saying the room was too beautiful for someone like her, Adrian gently smiled. "No." He shook his head. "It's finally beautiful enough for you." For the first time in decades, laughter returned to the Blackwood mansion. Martha no longer served meals. She sat at the dining table. She no longer waited outside Adrian's office. She walked in without knocking. She no longer called him sir. She simply called him Adrian. And every single time she did, he smiled like a little boy. Weeks later, the Blackwood family hosted a charity gala attended by business leaders, politicians, celebrities, and longtime family friends. As Adrian entered the ballroom, every camera turned toward him. Walking beside him was Martha. She wore a simple but elegant dress. Some guests exchanged confused glances. One executive quietly asked, "Mr. Blackwood, who is the lady accompanying you tonight?" The room grew silent. Adrian looked at Martha. Then he smiled with a pride greater than any business achievement he had ever accomplished. He took her hand and answered, "This is the woman who taught me what love looks like." He paused, his voice filled with emotion. "The woman who protected me before I could even open my eyes." Another pause. Then, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, he said, "My mother." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the ballroom erupted into applause. Martha lowered her head, tears filling her eyes. Not because she wanted recognition, but because, after 35 long years of silence, her greatest promise had finally been fulfilled. That evening, after the guests had gone home, Adrian and Martha sat together in the mansion's quiet garden. Between them rested the antique crystal vase that had started it all. Its broken pieces had been carefully restored. The cracks were still visible. But instead of hiding them, the craftsman had filled each fracture with delicate lines of gold. Adrian gently ran his fingers across the repaired vase. "It'll never be the same," he said softly. Martha smiled. "No." She looked at him with the same loving eyes she had the day he was born. But sometimes the things that have been broken become even more beautiful after they're healed. Adrian nodded. He finally understood. Families, like hearts, don't have to be perfect to be whole. As the camera slowly pulled away from the mansion, the narrator spoke one final time. "Some women give birth to a child. Others give their entire lives to raising one. Blood may begin a family, but love is what makes one last forever. And sometimes, the greatest heroes aren't remembered by history. They're remembered by one